I'm glad to be here in Camden with so many leaders committed to ending the opioid addiction. I appreciate Director Capelli and the chief as well for coming to talk about the challenges of Camden's residents and the uh, challenge that officers face on the front lines of this crisis every day. And I also want to thank Patricia DeShields and her uh, uh, colleagues from Project Hope for being here. Years ago, I helped secure the funding to jumpstart construction on Project Hope's Community Health Center, and it's great to see it become a leading provider for Camden residents struggling with substance abuse. Here in New Jersey, it's hard to find anyone who hasn't been touched by the opioid epidemic in some way. In 2018 alone, a record 3,163 New Jerseyans died of drug-related overdoses, including prescription killers, heroin, and fentanyl. Already within the first 3 months of 2019, drug overdose has claimed the lives of more than 600 people across our state. Behind these staggering numbers is unimaginable pain of children who've lost parents and parents who've lost children, of brothers who have lost sisters and sisters who've lost brothers, of employers who've lost workers and workers who have lost colleagues. I've long believed that we cannot overcome the opioid epidemic unless we all work together, law enforcement, government officials, health providers, and so on. Because a doctor can provide medication-assisted treatment, but she alone cannot stop fentanyl from making it onto the streets of our cities. A police officer can save a life by administering Narcan, but he alone cannot provide health coverage to the uninsured. A customs agent can seize fentanyl at our ports, but they cannot stop China from manufacturing this poison. We need to fight the opioid epidemic from every angle. That's why I fought for and continue to defend the Affordable Care Act, which extended coverage to nearly 1 million New Jerseyans and stopped health insurers from discriminating against people with pre-existing conditions like substance abuse disorder. That's why I've opposed Republican efforts to end Medicaid as we know it, because 1 in 4 Americans battling addiction depend on Medicaid. That's why I authored several provisions in the comprehensive opioids legislation that passed the Congress last fall and is now part of the law, including legislation to expand treatment options, keep more families together during recovery, and encourage the use of alternatives to opioids in emergency rooms. These are all steps in the right direction, and yet the body count continues to climb. That's partly because today's battle against opioid looks very different than it did even just a few years ago. Over the last 5 years, the potent synthetic opioid known as fentanyl has poured into our country from China and saturated our communities with deadly consequences. In fact, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention found that in 2017, fentanyl contributed to nearly 40% of the 72,000 fatal overdoses that took place across America. And contrary to President Trump's claims, building a wall at our southern border isn't a real solution. You can build a wall as high as the Empire State Building, and it won't stop drug traffickers from sneaking this poison through our legitimate points of entry. Just last year, the Port of Philadelphia, right across the river, was one of the largest ever fentanyl busts in our history. Canine teams discovered 110 pounds of fentanyl, about $1.7 million worth, hidden in a shipment of iron oxide from China. We also know that Chinese fentanyl funnels into the United States through Mexico. Earlier this year, Customs and Border officials announced the largest seizure in history, 254 pounds of fentanyl pills and powder hidden inside a cucumber truck at a legal port of entry. Law enforcement estimated that this bust alone would have been enough for 100 million lethal doses. Just think about that. fentanyl from China that could have killed 100 million people in our country. I've spent years fighting to increase security at our ports, including making sure every piece of cargo is scanned for illegal drugs, weapons, and other threats. But China shouldn't be trafficking this venomous drug into the United States to begin with. It has to stop. Last December, I was encouraged to see the administration push China to ban a wider range of fentanyl-related substances from being manufactured in their country. But as we all know, China has a long history of disregarding its international obligations and struggling to enforce its own drug laws. We need real accountability if we want to save American lives. That's why last week I, along with Senator Chuck Schumer and others, introduced the Fentanyl Sanctions Act. This new bipartisan legislation would ensure that the Chinese government holds traffickers and manufacturers accountable for the fentanyl that's poisoning Americans every single day. Our legislation would devote nearly $1 billion over the next 5 years to catching the rotten actors running this murderous marketplace, from fentanyl manufacturers to traffickers to financial institutions. We require the President to publicly report on these actors annually. We create a congressional commission to study fentanyl trafficking and present Congress with new additional steps to fight back. Our legislation would also impose real pressure on the Chinese actors involved in the fentanyl trade. Under the Fentanyl Sanctions Act, the chemical and pharmaceutical companies caught producing this poison would be blacklisted from U.S. markets. The bottom line is that we can't simply take China's word for it when they say that they'll crack down on fentanyl manufacturers, especially when American lives are at stake. With the Fentanyl Sanctions Act, we can send a clear message to the Chinese government that they must hold their citizens and their companies accountable, and if they don't, the United States will. Investing in port security, targeting fentanyl producers, expanding access to life-saving treatment. These are the kind of smart strategies we need to save American lives. Here's what we don't need. We don't need bluster about a border wall that won't stop the flow of fentanyl in American towns and cities. We don't need a legal assault on the Affordable Care Act that jeopardizes access to treatment for millions. We don't need budgets that strip the state and treasury departments of funding they need to protect our interests. We need all hands on deck. Health providers, law enforcement, Customs and Border agents, skilled diplomats and officials at every level of government working together to end the scourge of opioid addiction and to save American lives. And that's exactly what we're calling for and working towards here today in Camden.